All right, looks like the recording's going. So we'll go ahead and get started here. If I had to pick, I think I'd probably pick EF Core as the back end site and then do a static website on front, so combine the two. But that's for Van to decide. So welcome tonight. Thank you for having me. As Lee mentioned, I'm Tom Becker. I'm an .NET architect from Richmond, and I work for CapTech Consulting. We have an office up here in Reston as well, but I'm in the home Richmond office. So before we get going, I just want to say a special thank you to Lee. Some of you might know I was supposed to do this talk back in November. My wife had back surgery and couldn't get out of bed. So I've got 3 kids, you know, I'm sure a lot of you know how that goes. So I had to reschedule. Lee, thank you very much for accommodating and rescheduling me to November, today to February. So thank you for that. Thank you for all being flexible, and I hope this was worth the wait. So tonight, we're going to be talking about domain-driven design with CQRS and Mediatr. So lots to cover here. This is going to be a little more slide heavy than I normally like to give in presentations, but there's just a lot of terminology and things to go through here. We will get to code, I promise, but we're going to go through a decent number of slides first. I can change slides. That's good. There we go. All right, so for our agenda, we're going to talk about what is domain-driven design, CQRS pattern, Mediatr, both the package and the pattern, because they're spelled differently. The one without the O is the package by Jimmy Bogart. We'll have demo and then time for questions at the end. If you guys have any questions as we're going through, in person, just raise your hand, call out. I'll do my best to answer them as you're going through. You're not going to get my flow or anything, so just raise your hand. Folks online, I'll try to keep an eye out for the chat and hand raising and things like that. But if you might have to wait to the end on chat if I miss it. So sorry about that. Okay. So first big question, what is domain-driven design? Show of hands by people in the room and online, who's actually done domain-driven design? I'm impressed. Okay, so we got 5 people in the room. I don't see any hands online. Okay, so domain-driven design is a concept put out in 2003, so legally able to drink now, by Eric Evans in his book called Domain-Driven Design. And in that book, he said, domain-driven design is a design approach that focuses on modeling software to match a domain, according to input from that domain's expert. Cool. What's that mean? So a lot of words there, but what it boils down to is you should be writing your code in such a way that your business user, the person you are working with to write that code from the business side, can come and look at your code and say, yep, that's right. And yep, okay, we're doing it that way. That makes a lot of sense. They should be able to read your code and be able to say, yes, that's exactly what our business is doing. And you should be able to come back 6 months from now and say the same thing.
Is that the F-sharp book?
No, this is just a pattern book. It's called Domain-Driven Design. So no specific language there, but I don't know if he has F-sharp in it. I haven't read the whole thing. But basically, it should be apparent from the code what the business is doing. That's what it really all kind of boils down to. And with domain-driven design, he really recommends in the book that you split it up into kind of 2 phases. First phase being strategic design, second being tactical. In strategic design, we're going to be defining our domains and subdomains using ubiquitous language and defining what our entities and values are. And we'll get into what all this means in just a second. And then the second stage is your tactical design. We're actually defining those. This is hands-on keyboard. You're creating your entity objects, your value objects, and your aggregates. Again, we're getting into what all these terms mean in just a second. And so because of this part, the strategic design, it is really hard to start domain-driven design tomorrow on a project you're already doing. It's really hard to do. Domain-driven design really lends itself to 2 things, starting in greenfield and working very tightly with your business partners. That is a very important piece of this because of these things here. You're working with the business to define your domains and subdomains and using that ubiquitous language. So what are domains and subdomains? I'm a baseball fan. So there's a few people online that I recognize, so they'll know this, but if you use Braves fan, I know I'm in the wrong city for this, but I'm a Braves fan. So I'm sorry, all you Nationals fans who keep losing. So we're going to use baseball as a construct here to talk about our code and these bounded contexts. So we're going to define these contexts, which are consumable pieces of your application. So I've got a few examples here. We might have players, managers, teams. These are all different bounded contexts and domains and subdomains of my baseball application. We're not going to create all these tonight. There's just too many. But we're inside of each of these domains and subdomains, we're going to be using ubiquitous language. And that's just a $10 word for saying using the same thing as the business does. So inside my domain for player, I'm going to call it a player, right? Even though in my database, that might be actually the person table, right? So a person table, but in my context for player, I'm always going to be referring to that person, that entry in the database as a player, and that works. But in a different bounded context, it might be different. So over here, we have the MLBPA, the Major League Baseball Players Association. Inside of that context, that same person, you know, in the same table, they're not really a player over there because they're not playing the game. They're a member, right? They're a member of the Players Association. Same person, same thing, called different things. And that's a very important piece of, again, your domain-driven design because you want that ubiquitous language. So every bounded context will have the same terms that the business uses, even if they're different parts, right? Make sense? Seems like head nods. Great. And so the last piece of this domains and subdomains is the anti-corruption layer. Again, Eric likes to use these big words. Eric, like I know him. Eric Evans, the author, likes to use these big words. Anti-corruption layer, it's a translation layer. We want to be able to pass information between these different domains and use them differently in different spaces, right? So I'm playing a game, right? And I've got my pitcher, okay? Got Max Fried up on the mound. What does the game need to know about Max Fried? Do they care? He was born, making this up, Akron, Ohio in 1999. Probably not. Good information for the baseball card, but not really relevant to the game. What do we need to know for the game? He's a righty. He throws a really hard fastball. He's got a good slider. That's what we need to know for the game. So the anti-corruption layer is just a translation layer. So the game's asking, hey, player, give me the information I need. And it's just trimming down that list of information that's giving you just to what you need. And it's translating it into the same ubiquitous language that you need for that domain. Domains and subdomains. Everyone good? Clear? Make sense? Yeah? Okay. So from here, we're going to move on to entities. So now we have our domains and subdomains. Now we're going to define our entities. Entities are things that kind of change inside of your system. These are your mutable kind of things. They're going to change often. Things you take actions on is a good way to think of them. And inside of domain-driven design, if the IDs match, then they're the same object. So this is a pretty drastic example. The IDs match, but the first and last names are completely different. But inside of DDD, this is the same exact object because the IDs match. A more reasonable example would be that pitcher and player, right? So the game has a pitcher, the other domain has a player, but in the pitcher value, or excuse me, pitcher entity object inside of that subdomain does not have the same number of fields necessarily as the player does. It has the same ID, so that's where you kind of match things up. So even if the count of the properties are different or whatever, this is how you say it's the same object inside of domain-driven design. So because of that, if you want to do equality, you're going to have to override your hash code and your equals methods and all that, because again, a lot of these will be different inside of your different subdomains. So that's an entity. The opposite of that, or not opposite, but the complement to that is your value object. Value objects are immutable. These things aren't changing that often. They still have business rules. They're still important that we check things on, that we're making sure we have a valid email address inside of this example here. And unlike our entities, our value objects don't necessarily have IDs. So if the properties are the same, then it's the same object. So a little bit different there between your domains, entity values and value objects. So value objects are something that you could take an idea from DDD today. I said earlier that you can't start your project tomorrow if you're already midstream with domain-driven design. And that's probably very true because of some of the things we already talked about. But there are tons of concepts from domain-driven design that you could take and use tomorrow. And this, if you could leave today with one thing that you learned from me, your value objects. You should start using these everywhere. So email address has rules. We know what that looks like, right? How many of you in your code today, and I'm going to raise my hand here too, have a helper method that says validate email or something along those lines. Yeah, a lot of head shakes in the room. Me too. But if we make it a value object, the only way I can create an email address, it has to be valid. I'm going to get an exception if not. So the invalid email exception. So I don't have to have that method anywhere. I'm promoting that value from a string to a class or in a record in this case, because it's immutable. And now I know for sure that this always is right and valid. And then I could do more interesting things in that as well. So if I wanted to compare domains, right? So I'll make sure it's Microsoft or CapTech or whatever. I could add that in here too. So lots of things you can do with this. If I'm tying this back to my baseball analogy, just to give you another example, batting average, right? Batting average cannot go below 0, although some people try desperately to do that. And it can't go above 1,000, right? It's a bounded between 1 and 0. It's always a decimal. So that's a business rule I could add in my constructor. So I always know that this is a valid object. I could do that for ERA and batting average and WAR and all these other things, because WAR can go negative, wins above replacement. Not a baseball nerd out, but that's a value. So you can add a lot of these things that have business rules in your system, but don't necessarily lend themselves to legal entities. These are just bounded little things in your system that have rules around them that you always want to be true. So value objects, very useful no matter where you are. Doesn't have to be domain driven. Best practices will say that you should always have more value objects and entities, and that just thinking about it makes sense, right? You're gonna have a lot more of these decimals and email addresses and other things that you're checking rather than just larger objects that you're taking actions on, right? Lee.
Yeah, I was kind of struggling with the idea of your batting average being immutable.
Well, you would always create a new one, right? You never update, you would always update. You would update the record. You create a new record rather than just setting a decimal somewhere. It's basically equates to the same thing, but you're always doing the check on the creation of the thing that it's valid.
So anything could be a value object if you always throw it away and create a new one.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Okay. Yep. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What's the win in doing that?
What's the win?
What you were talking about, and you, in the case of batting average, just, from a efficiency perspective, what's the value of that?
So if I'm creating a batting average, I know, and I can just create it, not have to worry about every time I assign it, no matter where I assign it, I have to check any sort of business rules on it. That's the biggest one there. So, I can check it 1 or 0 is your bounds there. Every time I assign it, I don't have to check it. It's just in this one spot and always there. So you can, if you have a setter somewhere else, you could do this with a, property with a hidden setter. You can do the same thing, same idea. But in domain-driven design, you're just promoting this to a whole object. So this has meaning. This has significance inside of my application. Any other questions? All right. So we've talked about entities. We talked about values. So that begs the question, when? Which one? I'm going to give you the classic consulting answer. It depends, because it really does. I tried to think of a good example, even on the way up here, of my baseball analogy, where this would make obvious sense. And I couldn't do it. So here's one that I've read that makes a lot of sense to me, and hopefully it'll make sense. Address. There's a lot of rules on address, right? You've got to have at least an address 1. You've got a city, state, and zip. Zip looks a certain way, either 5 or 5 plus 4, whatever. Let's say your states always have 2 digits or 2 characters, whatever. A lot of rules. That lends itself to a value object, right? A lot of times it does. Maybe you're dropping a pin on, we're in Microsoft, so Bing Maps. Or maybe just putting it on a envelope or displaying a screen, whatever. You're not taking actions on that address. You're not really doing much with it. So that value makes sense, right? Now, let's say we're writing Zillow. That address means a lot then, right? Because everything is going to be driven off that address. Your listings, your Zestimate, whatever they call it, your Zillow estimate, all your bookings, everything like that. All of that is driven off your address. So that at that point is a really important thing in your system. And at that point, it should probably be about an entity object, not a value, right? So this is where you have to really work with your business to figure out which one is which. Does that make sense? And if anyone comes up with a baseball analogy that works, I'll take it and use it the next time I get it. So lastly, we have aggregates. And aggregates are a group of entities and objects. So this is where things kind of merge all together. Just like IDs, they have a value, they have a transactional boundary. So when you take an action on these things, that means it's an atomic transaction. Everything gets shot to the database at once. And then they have these things, again, Eric Evans like these big words, business invariance rules. These are just business rules that require a valid save. So what do you need to do to have a valid save? So an example of an aggregate might be an at-bat, right? So I have my at-bat aggregate. There's lots of value objects and entity objects in there. So I've got my pitcher, I've got my batter, I've got the game maybe, I've got balls and strikes at the at-bat. And let's just say my aggregate has a method called strikeout, right? That happens all the times in games. So when a strikeout happens, a lot of things can happen with that, right? Strikeout could end an inning. It could just end the batter. So at that point, we just maybe update the batter's batting average. We update the pitcher's ERA, maybe, whatever it may be, and that's it. But what else could happen? We could end an inning, which means we got to change a bunch of other stuff in the game. We could end the whole game, right? So that's when this business invariance rule would kick in. We want to make sure that the winning team is the higher score. So all of these things can happen in a strikeout. But we have this one thing here, this transactional boundary, that this is an atomic save. So it could just be really quick. Change batters and that'd be kind of done, right? Save the ERA, save the batting average, done. But if we have to do all these other things like change innings and close games, maybe that winning of this game by this team updated the standings overall. So we need to, update the Braves are now in first, whatever it is. So this is an atomic transaction. So if we had to do all these checks, now we have a bunch of database locks, right? Or potentially for database locks. So the business invariant, this is where the business invariance rule comes in. What is the bare minimum I really need in order to save this and have it be a valid system state? Okay, so if I'm closing the game's done, let's just say I need to save the score and then update the batting average and the ERAs and maybe the standings. That can happen asynchronously. Doesn't have to happen right now, but I do need, the save the score and record the winner. And that's all I really need to do. So you can have as many business invariance rules as you need, but just be careful that, you might lock up your database if you have a ton of these. So DDD really kind of lends itself to large applications, like I said earlier, and asynchronous applications. So if you're going to be doing these other things like updating the standings, maybe that can be done offline. You spin up a task, put it on a queue, whatever it is, and you just fire it off and that gets done by a separate process. So those are aggregates. Any questions on those? We're going to switch to CQRS in just a second, but I'm going to sum up DDD. But any questions on aggregates before we sum up here? Okay. So DDD, this is it in a very high level nutshell. There's a lot more to it. If this piqued your interest, I would recommend getting the book or reading about it. There's lots of good articles out there. It seems like Lee and company, I'm sorry, I forgot your name. No name tag. Are doing this on a client site now or started recently. So they might have some good tools for you as well or get some good resources to get started. But DDD lends itself to large systems that are greenfield, and it's really hard to do to start. So if you're just doing a CRUD application, DDD might be, juice might not be worth the squeeze. But there are a lot of ideas that came out of here, a lot of things we talked about that can help you today. And when we start getting to the code side, I'll be calling these out. But I just want you to think about this and see if you can see where you would use these in your application. So your domains and subdomains, your aggregate, your business invariance rules and sending things off to queues, other places, your value objects, again, that's your big one that I want you to take away today. All sorts of things there that you can use today. Ideas, not the whole shebang, okay? So next we're switching to CQRS. Anyone in the room give me the accurate name of what CQRS stands for?
Command query segregation response.
There you go. Got it. I always want to say command query response segregation, but it's responsibility segregation. CQRS, command query responsibility segregation. So when I first read about this pattern, this was a while ago, maybe a little over a decade ago, and it made a lot of sense to me. Didn't really use it for a long time. And I'll explain why in a second, but CQRS basically said, this is our normal application. We've got CRUD stuff, right? Create, reads, updates, deletes. CQRS says to do this. We want to separate our reads from our creates, updates, and deletes, our commands, things that change objects in your system from your reads. And why would we do this? Well, when I first read about this, the big idea was this. So maybe you had a very heavy read application. Well, you could scale up your database and have a separate service on top of that and be on your way. And your reads would be a lot quicker than your updates would be. Maybe your updates would have some sort of asynchronous processing back to your reads, and that all worked well. Idea is great, but I'm going to go out on a limb. Most of the applications that we write, we're not doing this, right? We're going to have one database. It may be sharded, whatever, but it's one database. We're not having 6 databases for reads and one for, like, it's just not going to happen most of the time. These is edge case. So where can CQRS help us? Well, we can think of it a little bit more micro level and say, instead of having the database, what about just services, right? That makes sense. We talked a lot about that when talking about microservices, right? Back, relatively recently with the whole scaling up and, using Azure to do your sliders to move things up and down. And that all works well too. And that's CQRS as well. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. We're talking about code architecture today. And what we're going to be doing is separating our things going over the wire, our DTOs, our data transformation objects, between our creates and our commands and our reads, and why we would do that. A lot of times we send things to the front end to view. We're sending more than the user is actually allowed to update. So using my baseball example, I want to display my baseball card. I'm going to display my team name, and I'm going to display my position, maybe, right? And let's say I get drafted, right? And let's say the same screen allows me to be drafted or traded. So the same screen allows me to be traded. If I use that same DTO that I'm using for my player object to display on the screen to then send back, well, this is the new ID for the team, right? This is who you got traded to. But if I'm using the same DTO, I'm also sending my position, where I was born, the year I was born, if I'm pitch right and bat left, or that's not anything that the trade operation cares about, right? And if you send these over, yeah, the possibility of slowing down your systems there, but honestly, with the internet these days, most of that is not going to be a problem. Something to think about if you're doing large scales of data. But most of the time, it's small enough that it's pretty insignificant. You're saving a couple bytes, not that big of a deal. But where the bigger benefit is you coming back a few months later, and the trade operation is just a drastic example. But if you're on a screen where you're updating lots of things, and there's some business rule that you're not allowed to update birthday as a random thing. And if you're using AutoMapper, who uses AutoMapper? Yeah, lots of people. So if you have some business rule that you're not allowed to update your date of birth using AutoMapper, and you're sending it back in the front end, well, guess what I can do? I can intercept that and change it, and then it's updated in the database. And if you're using AutoMapper, you're never going to see that. So you could accidentally update your stuff without really intending to. So you're saving bytes, good, not a terribly compelling reason, but you're also saving yourself later from accidental updates and things like that. So separating these things out makes logical sense, as well as saving yourself later. So any questions on CQRS? And we'll see what this looks like in a minute when we get to code. We're almost there. We have one more section before code, I promise. We'll get there. All right. So now we're going to move on to Mediator. Anyone in the room or online, raise your hand if you've used the Mediator package. Yeah, great. Okay. So we got one in the room. Let's see anyone. Oh, a couple thumbs up online. Awesome. That's great. Good. So Mediator package is the same, written by the same dude who did AutoMapper. I don't know how this guy has this much time. It's amazing. The stuff he puts out is fantastic. Jimmy Bogard. And I've got a link to the package in the resources section that has a slide. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. So the Mediator package is great, and we're going to talk a lot more about that when we get to the code section. The Mediator pattern, one with the O, is what we're going to talk about in the slide. Hopefully this looks pretty familiar. Everyone, this is pretty standard stack, right? Yeah, we got our controller, we're talking about web API, we have a controller, we're going to call our business logic, Business logic calls our data access calls our data access. Written millions of these. Everyone else in the room too? All right. Written a different way, it looks like this. We have a controller that calls A, calls B, and calls C, different classes. Those A, B, and C called repo. Fine. Again, nothing wrong with this. Simple application. Nothing wrong with this. You don't have to implement Mediatr here. But as you start getting more complicated, these lines grow, right? Again, this is not terrible, but add another third controller, add some more business logic classes, you're gonna have these lines going everywhere. It's really hard to follow. Even add some more backend services here. So what the Mediatr pattern says that we're gonna put a man in the middle. We're gonna take the responsibility away from the controllers to know where this thing is actually going to be routed. So this is where Mediatr comes in. So my controllers only know about my man in the middle, Mediatr. And the Mediatr, you're going to send a request to the Mediatr. Mediator's going to say, I got you, fam. And it's going to send it off to where it needs to go. And that's it. That's Mediatr in a nutshell. So that's what the Mediatr package does. It just makes it a really simple way to do this. Make sense? All right. So now we're on to everyone's favorite part, the got my folder here. Realize I didn't turn off Teams. I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick because I know some people from CapTech are on and I don't want them messing with me. Okay, so is that pretty visible to everyone in the room? Do you want me to up zoom on that? Is that all right? One more? Okay. Where's my zoom? There it is. Good. Excellent. Okay, so I've got a pretty bare bones solution here. I've got 5 projects. This is a .NET 7. When I started this, 8 wasn't in full release. I just didn't download it yet. So it's a 7 project, but it's the minimal web API. Should look very familiar once we get going to everyone who's done web API recently. And you can see I've got no controllers. We're going to be building those as we go. I've got my infrastructure, which right now just has my context in it. Again, we're doing some baseball stuff. It looks just like every other EF context out here. And we got players, teams, and positions. That's it. I've got my common, which just has an exception in it. My domain, which has my player, position, and team. So these are where these live. And then I've got this last class library called application. And I've got my DTOs in there. So we're going to be spending most of our time in that application class library. And we're going to create a few folders in here. And this is where some DDD concepts are going to come in, right? And some CQRS concepts. So let's start by just getting a list of players. So we're going to add a directory. We're going to name this directory queries. And I already added it, but didn't delete it from the deck. Just hold on. We're just going to see if we can delete these from here. It's just going to make my life easier later. All right. Okay. So we're going to add a directory called queries. And under queries, so this is our CQRS bit. So anything query related is going to go to this folder. And then we're going to add another folder. This is our DDD bit where we're separating out our domains, subdomains. We'll call that player. So everything right? Oh, we got really out of focus. Oh, wait, I didn't think I fixed it. Okay. All right, so we have our kind of domain or subdomain of player. And then under that domain, we're going to add our first Mediatr request. And we're going to say, slanted desk can be fits here. All right, mouse keeps sliding on me. We're going to get all players. So this is going to be, we want all players, so we're not going to pass anything into this, but we're still going to make this a record. And we're going to implement an interface that comes from Mediatr called iRequest. And then it's going to return an outcome. So outcome is a class that I wrote. It's in the infrastructure. Yeah, infrastructure. I linked my GitHub repo out here, so if you guys want to take a look at it. Basically, it's just a wrapper for common outcome success, not found in valid data. You don't have to use this if you don't want. but it just makes writing this a lot easier for the demo purposes. So I've got my request, and that's all I need there. So now I need something to handle this request. When I send this to Mediatr, Mediatr needs to know what to do with it. So I'm going to add another class called getAllPlayers request handler. And I'm going to implement another interface called iRequest handler. So again, that's from the Mediatr package. And this one takes two parameters. What is the thing I'm handling? So in this case, get all player request. And what's it returning? So outcome. Okay. Then we're going to implement this interface. So we have the handle method. Into the handle method, we are getting the player request, get all players request. And then we're on the outside, on the outbound, we're passing back an outcome. So you guys don't have to watch me write code. I am going to steal my get all players request handler from my snippets, paste that dude in. And this is just entity framework. So I'm injecting into the constructor my context, and then just getting all of my players out, including teams and positions, so I can fill out those, and just returning that. Okay, so this is my handler. That's it. So this is beyond the ceremony of saying this is my request handler, this is my request. All this is pretty standard C# goodness, right? So now we have our first request handler. We now need to make a controller, so we can actually call this web API. So let's call it player. Okay, and again, I'm gonna steal some code so you don't have to watch me type everything. Oh, let's paren. Then we don't have this yet, so we're going to. Okay, so into my controller, I'm injecting this iSender thing. Again, this is from Mediatr. iSender is a stripped down version. If you've used Mediatr before, there's in some versions just iMediator class or interface, excuse me. iSender is a stripped down version of that just does send. That's all it does. There's different versions of send, but you can see on line 24, we're just calling send. There's an analog for publish, which we'll get to in a little bit, but and then there's iMediator still does exist, and that does send and publish. So depending on your controller, whatever you need, just inject your minimum, kind of make sure you're not doing extra things. But the difference between send and publish inside of the Mediatr package, again, this is not Mediatr, the pattern, there's no O in this talk anymore. The Mediatr package, send is a one-way request. One-way like transaction, your normal data in, data out kind of thing. You're sending it, you're always going to be expecting a response back from this dude. So you wait for your response. Publish is a broadcast message. It's a notification. You say, hey, whoever cares, this thing happened. And then you don't necessarily expect a response back. You can, but you don't necessarily expect one back. And there can be multiple listeners for the same thing. With the send, you're just going to get one. Make sense? Okay, so I've got send here. Because that's all we need. So I'm sending to Mediatr my get all players request, and that's it. So Mediatr knows that I've got this request. I know how to handle this, and I'm going to send you back this response. Okay, so just to show there's nothing up my sleeve, let's go ahead and run this guy, and we'll see if this works. It'll take a second to build. Build succeeded. I've got Insomnia here. It's just my preferred API tools, Postman, essentially. So I'm going to call a player, and it's going to, first time you hit it, of course, you got to warm up your .NET services. Take a little longer than normal. So we've got all our players that we have in our database. So it worked. Hooray, we wrote our first Mediatr. No one else is excited as I am. Okay, that's fine. I get that a lot. So that is our first call to Mediatr. Pretty easy, right? Made sense that we just have the request, send that off to Mediatr. Mediatr knows how to handle this. And from there, it's just normal .NET. Okay, so we've got all players, excuse me. Now how do we pass information down with our request? request. We need to get one of these things, right? One of these players. So let's do that. So just like before, we're going to create two classes. A lot of times I keep these in the same because they are sort of tightly coupled for our requests and our commands. I'll put them in the same file just because you're kind of always tying them together. You don't have to. I keep them out separate here just for clarity, but you can kind of put them in one file. A lot of times that works out well too. So I'm going to say get player request. Got a class. Actually going to make it a record, just like before. Into this record, I'm going to want to pass in a quid, and it's going to be my player ID. And I'm going to, again, have iRequest pass back an outcome. Okay, so I have my request. It's going to have one property on it. For those of you, is everyone familiar with that record syntax with the properties at the top? It's the same thing as creating a property inside, just less code for me to write. Less time for me to show you what a bad typer I am. Okay, so now we have our request for our get player. Now we need our handler. No, okay. No one's playing along, so let's create our handler. Get player request. So this is just naming. Most of this is just naming convention with the request handler. And that you don't have to call them this, but it just makes things easier to find. You know, implementing request makes it a request. Implementing iHandler or request handler makes it something. So just like before, I'm going to steal code. So you play your request there. So you don't have to see me type. And just like before, we have our handle method. Gets our player request. We're checking our player request to make sure it's not empty. We're just doing standard validation kind of thing. Returning invalid data. This is a really common outcome to just make things kind of easy and repeatable. And then from there, we're just getting the player. The player doesn't exist. We're returning not found. Otherwise, we're doing the mapping. And normally I'd implement AutoMapper here. I just wanted to be really explicit for some things we're doing, just a few to kind of map each field out, but AutoMapper would work great here too. So that is our get single. Now we want to call this thing. So let's go back to our player controller. Steal some more code. Let's see, player controller. Our next method here. And paste that in. So just like before, we're creating on line 35 our request. We have our get player request, passing in the player ID we got from the URL that's defined on 33, and we're sending it off. That's it. So all of our methods in our controller are going to look exactly like this. The only thing that's going to change is my outcome types. So each time my outcome, like I've got to change my success, this is now a player DTO, not a list of player DTO. So all of my controllers are very repeatable. This is copy and paste stuff. You guys can work through this and not have to think about what your controllers look like. This also makes dependency injection, but unit testing your controllers very simple too, because you don't have all these injectables. You just have the one, and then you're just sending it off and getting it back. So makes things very easy there too. Okay, so let's run this again to show you that our single succeeded. All right, back to Insomnia. So we're going to run this. We'll just grab our first one. We'll grab my boy Matt Olson, and we'll switch to get players or get single player. Put his ID on there. Wait for our first load, and then we got our single request back for Matt Olson. Makes sense, right? No problems there. Any questions, concerns? Okay, awesome. So we've gotten another benefit using records on top of syntax. Sure. I saw a comment in there. I didn't get to read the whole thing. I'm not actually on the meeting. I'm not sure how I would see those.
So it was a comment that records also give you the benefit of being able to compare them with property values.
Yes.
So you get call.
Very true. Thank you for that. Yes. Where I'm using them now, it just makes it easier for me typing. But yes, there's lots of benefits for adding records for changing immutable objects to records. Okay, so we've got a couple queries there, right? We're creating our player. We're getting all of them. We're getting one of them. Now let's draft a player. Let's create a new one, right? So draft a player, not create a player, right? Because that's not what the business would say. This is your ubiquitous language where you can start using things today. So calling the things the same thing the business would. So I'm going to create another folder under my application. Don't do that. And I'm going to call this commands. This is our CQRS bit. Splitting things out. I'm going to create my domain, subdomain. So I'll call that player. So we're only going to be talking about players here. We just don't have enough time in this meeting to like create a whole stats API where we're going to talk about different bits and parts. But if you were to add other things in here, I might have other subdomains with like team stats. So I might have a whole team folder where everything related to the team would go. I might have something specific to a stat type if I wanted to get all the highest ERAs or whatever. So I might have a stat folder. And so it's not full domain-driven design. You're not separating these out into separate, bounded contexts that they never will touch. But it's taking concepts off here to make things a lot easier to find later. So if I'm doing something with the player, that's going to be in the player folder. It's a command, so I know what's going to be under there. So it's just taking concepts from our domain-driven design that we can use in our code today, and that's why I'm separating things out like this. In a full-blown application, it'd be a lot more than just one domain. But again, this is an hour-long presentation, so you guys don't want to see me do this 30, 40 times. So we're going to create a new request, but we're going to call it command. So this is where it gets a little confusing with CQRS, command query responsibility segregation, because we're separating our requests or gets from our commands. We're sending a request to Mediatr. It's always a request. It doesn't change from command to command. It's always a request. So this is going to be draft player command, just to keep things kind of, we know what the object is doing, but it's going to implement requests. A lot of people will not mask, but create a new interface called iCommand that just has iRequest on it, just to separate things out even more and make it kind of really easy to see what's doing. I can keep this bare bones, just base Mediatr for tonight, but that's something you definitely can do. So I am going to implement iRequest. And it's going to have an outcome. And make it a record. And into this, I am going to have my draft player DTO. So to date, in this talk, we've been using our player DTO. And now I have a different DTO called draft player. So let's just pull these up side by side so you can see this again. This is our CQRS splitting out our commands and our queries. These are very similar, but slightly different. So on my draft player, you can see I don't have a team name. When you're drafting a player, I can't change a team name. So it's not in my DTO, right? But when I'm showing a player, I probably want to see that instead of just the GUID, right? Because that's not going to be helpful to anyone. So when I'm drafting a player, I'm only sending back the things to the database or to my service that actually needed in order to draft this player. So this, again, is CQRS. This is splitting things out and keeping your DTOs separate. Okay, so I'm using the draft player DTO in my draft player command. Just like before, we are going to, where am I? Commands player, there we go. I'm going to add a draft player command and I'm stealing code again. Oh, just taking that out. That's something we're going to get to in just a moment. Sneak peek of what we're doing in just a second. I thought I removed that. Okay, there we go. So we have our draft player. We have our handler. We're checking if the team exists. We're checking if the position exists. And then we're creating our player, adding it to the database, and then saving it. Again, just pure .NET Core stuff, right? No problems there. So let's go ahead and add that to our controller. And just like before, it is going to look just like all your other controllers. We just have a command. We have a request that we're sending to Mediatr, and we're just sending it off. Import preferences. Here we go. All right. So we have our post from the body for our draft player DTO. We have our draft player request command, and we're sending that off to Mediatr. Again, looks just like the one above it. This is the nice thing that they all look the same. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. This is the last of the really repetitive stuff. All right, build succeeded. And we are going to create a player. I am finally going to be drafted by the Atlanta Braves. It's going to be great. So we have all my information here. And you notice my email address is not accurate, right? This is not a valid email address. Okay. So remember what I said earlier about our value objects? This is where they come into play. So I'm going to click send. It should work. I was drafted. Fantastic. Dream come true. So I'm going to take my ID here. And I'm going to drop it in my player. You see that allowed it to save. So I just have a string email address right now. I didn't do any validation on it. Let's take that domain-driven design concept of promoting that to a value object, and let's see what happens then. Okay. So before things get really bad, because we try to run this again after I add that value object, it's not actually going to allow me to create the entities because it's a. So I'm going to just go ahead and delete. I'm undrafted. I got dropped, DFA'd. So I'm no longer in the database. So let's add our value object to validate our email address. So inside my domain folder, and this is where I'm keeping all my domain objects and my entity objects and my value objects. So I've got a folder called value objects. Just probably guess what I'm going to put in here. Create a new class, record, and we'll name it email address. And we are going to steal more code. Okay. So this looks, okay. Had a little red dot there. I thought something was wrong. This should look pretty much the same what you saw in the slide deck. A little bit different. We're using the generated regex pattern instead of just having it, just the normal way to do it. We're doing a few more validations to make sure that, it's not empty before you put the regex on it, that kind of thing. And then, as I said, you should override the hash code equals in the two-string. So it's just doing the same thing we talked about earlier in the slide deck. We're just validating the email address when you create the thing. Okay. So let's use it. So I've got my email address, and on my player, I no longer want email address to be a string. I want this to be an email address. That should break a few things. So I've got my application queries and commands all broken, which makes sense. So I now want to make this a new email address. Okay, good. About that, so it's nice and pretty. And then our queries, same thing. We want to say value, or we can use the two-string. So whatever one you want to do. Two-string. Okay, so that all works. That's fine. But we didn't tell Entity Framework how to map the thing, right? So in order for this to work, we need that to happen. So we need to create a configuration. And so for every value object you create inside your system, if you just wanted to kind of be transparent for anyone using your domain objects, you need to create a configuration inside of Entity Framework to tell Entity Framework how to map this from a simple string to an actual class object. So we'll go ahead and do that. That's going to be in our infrastructure. Got a new folder. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say I did not delete the old one. Yep. So just add configurations and then add a player configuration. Okay. Player configuration. It's pretty simple. It's going to tell Entity Framework that for the type of player, when you're building this thing on the way in, it's use the value, dot value. On the way out, you're going to convert this to email address using the value. And that's it for the configuration. So one kind of tedious or repetitive, I guess, thing, if I wanted to use email address on manager, I'm going to have to do that same thing for the manager class. So everywhere you use that email address, everywhere you use that value object, you have to make sure you do this mapping everywhere. Same thing with all the other types we talked about. If I wanted to add ERA or batting average or anything else, I'd have to add that configuration. So just something to think about when you're doing this. When you're practicing this, I forgot that step a ton. So just remember to do it. And then in order to use that configuration, we need to update our context to tell it to use it. This step is one and done because we're saying that load all configurations in the assembly of baseball context. So this step is only once. You have to map each thing every time. Okay, so let's go ahead and run again. So we just changed our entity objects. We didn't change our commands or anything really. We just told it to use the email address object now rather than the straight string. So now we have create player. And again, invalid email address. Hit send, balls right the world. We should get an invalid email exception, which is what it's expected. Excellent. So you can see at the top, invalid email exception, just what we expected. So now we're no longer have this invalid data coming in. Change that to have an actual @ symbol. Should allow it to go right through. So great. Now we have a value object in our system. Questions on that? Okay. In the last 10 minutes or so, we might run a little over an hour. I want to show you two other neat features of the Mediatr package. One of them is pipeline behaviors. So right now we have a pipeline of just my request. That's the only thing in there. It just fires it off and does that. We're going to add a pipeline behavior that is at the end of my request, but you can put them before or after. You can chain multiple of them together. But this one is going to be a timer. I want to know how long these things take. I want to write that to App Insights or wherever. So I want to add to my pipeline how long these things take. And I don't have to do this for every single one of them. I just have to create one pipeline, and it's across the board. Any request coming in is going to be logged by time. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to get a drink first. We're going to get more water. Here we go. Okay. So we're going to create a behavior. We're going to put that inside of our application class library. And we're going to call it timer behavior. Just tell the code. And let's take a look at it. Okay, good. Always gets me worried when I copy paste something and then the thread just. All right, so we have our timer behavior. It's implementing the iPipeline behavior, again, from the Mediatr package. It's taking in a request and response where the request is of type iRequest. So we have generics that are type of the iRequest, which is the thing we're passing around all the time inside of Mediatr. This is what we're sending to Mediatr. So in our constructor, we're just this normal .NET logger, nothing else here. Beyond that, so just going to log to the console right now, but you can inject whatever you want here. I've used behaviors to check additional security. So we know you're allowed to access this because your JWT token or whatever. But what if I want to add row level security? Well, you can do that here. So you can go check the database. You can check the ID of this object. You know where request is coming in. So you can say this request has this ID. Do you have access to this ID? You can do row level security that way. You can enrich the headers coming in. So you can add like additional information that you might want to pass down, all sorts of good things. But right now we're just doing a simple log that I want to know how long this thing took. So my handle method has my request. It has next, which is the thing where the pipeline is going to next. Then it has a cancellation token. So on line 21, we have our response.await next. This is the next thing in the pipeline. And it should always be, or in this instance, it will always be your request, right? This is the last thing. So we're starting a stopwatch, we're sending it off to what it's going to do, we're stopping it, and then we're logging a message. And that's it. So this is a pretty simple pipeline behavior. This is considered an open behavior because I'm not limiting it. I'm taking a bunch of generics, right? I'm taking in whatever. I'm not creating a closed, I guess it's called closed, pipeline behavior. So there's different ways to register those, but we're going to show you how to register the open behavior because this is one of the more straightforward ones to kind of look at. So let's grab this and update our configuration. So we added a behavior. We're not touching any of our classes that we've already written. We're just going to come into our program and we're going to add a configuration to Mediatr. So I didn't show this earlier, but this is where you configure Mediatr. So again, this is just coming from the packages, we're adding to the services. Any Mediatr that has the draft player DTO, that's in my application class library. Just register anything. It uses reflection to get all your requests and request handlers, that kind of thing. So this is where I'm registering Mediatr. And then I'm going to register a pipeline behavior. If I hit the right button. Here we go. So as I said, this is an open behavior. That's because we're not passive. We're just kind of saying whatever comes in, comes in. We're of type timer behavior, and that's it. So I've added my pipeline behavior. So let's go ahead and run this, and we'll watch when we call our services. We'll watch our console and see what happens. Any questions on the pipeline behaviors? Okay. All right. So we'll call get players. Go ahead and send that. First one always takes longest. So there it is. So we have received request. This came from our pipeline behavior. Received request, get all players request, and it took 3,148 milliseconds. That's just the warm up normal .NET or service type thing. So if I run it again, you can see it took 36 milliseconds. And you can see this is happening after my calls to the database. So you can see all my database calls here. It always happens after because that's the last thing in the pipeline. That's when everybody. So now I've got a timer on all of my calls. I didn't have to write anything in particular for any specific call. So it's a get player request. Took that. Pretty cool, right? Pretty easy to implement. Any questions there on the pipeline behaviors? Okay. The next thing I'm going to talk about is what I alluded to earlier with notifications. Publish. So this one is a little bit beefier. Still not good. We'll be in time for beer. Don't worry. Notifications can be used in a lot of different ways. You might just want to broadcast a message out to the system. Just say, hey, something happened. You might have a listener somewhere that then writes to a queue or whatever. Lots of different reasons to have a notification in your system. What we're going to set up today are a domain event. So something happened in my system that may happen a lot, and you just want to abstract the code away, say this thing happened, go take care of it someplace else. How we're using them today is not out of process. We're not spinning up any additional tasks. It's all in the same thread. Don't think there's anything magical happening here. It's just we're interrupting later down the pipeline to handle all of our domain events at once. So it's still happening in the same thread as everything else. So if you add a bunch of domain events that you do not make asynchronous, you're just going to really slow everything down. And I'll point out where you can start to make things async, where you can drop things on queues and like things like that. This is in process domain events. Okay, so let's go ahead and create this. Again, this one gets a little beefier. So if you have any questions as we're going through, stop me, we'll discuss. So let's create a folder for domain events. I'm going to create a new record called new player domain event. So new players can happen on a team, can happen multiple ways. You can be drafted, you can get traded, you can call it from assignment, whatever. Like 3 different ways, just off the top of my head, that a new player can be on a team. We might want to do something that happens, right? That might be a domain event. We don't want to have that same logic spread across multiple controllers. Domain event. Make sense? That's the kind of concept we're using here today. So we are going to implement iNotification, which comes from the Mediatr library. We are going to take in a string of player name and a string with the team name. Okay, and that's it. Semi at the end of that. All right, so that's our domain event. That's it. It's taking in two things. You should probably keep these pretty trim. You know, don't put everything in your domain event. If you can put an ID that you can go look up later, great. But these domain events should be pretty light because they're consuming memory. right? Because we're keeping these things in memory until we get down to the spot we're actually publishing. So try and keep them kind of light. So now we're going to have our handler, just like we did for our normal requests. So we're going to have a new player domain event handler. Things get very long, and I'm going to steal code again. So this one should be event, and we'll steal the handler. Okay. I want to change that. It should be player. All right, so our handler, just like the pattern, should be very similar to what we've seen before. We've got our pipeline handler, our request handler, and now we have our notification handler, right? Jimmy did a great job making this very easy to follow. So inside of notification handler, we have our new player domain event. That's the thing we're handling. In this notification, we're implementing or injecting logger into the configuration and to the constructor. Just like the logging behavior, you can inject whatever you want here. So if you want to inject your database context, fantastic, do that. And so where I've used this a few times is statusing. So inside of your application, statuses can change for a variety of different reasons. That may not have anything to do with user taking action on the screen, right? So you might hit 0 on your balance, so now you're in default or whatever. So those domain events can happen many different ways. You might need to update a status. So a lot of times what I'll do is have a status handler and just say the status changed on this ID from this to this. And inside of here, I just insert a new status record. So I can just abstract that away from everywhere. That might need to happen. I can just do it in one spot. Yes, you could create a class, inject that somewhere and do that, but this is just kind of an easier way to kind of not think about it and just a different way to do it. You know, you choose for yourself, which if it makes sense. So all we're doing is logging out, welcome whomever to the team. Where are you? Oh, team name. All right. Helps if I keep things the same name. All right. That's my pipe. That's my domain event. Now we need some structure to add these domain events. So those eagle-eyed viewers at home might have noticed earlier that inside of my domain object or domain class, I had this thing called entity. So entity is an abstract class, and it allows it gives me support for adding new domain events to a class. So we have a private list of domain events. You can add them, remove them, clear them, get a read-only list of them, whatever. This is just adding things to a list right now. So for player, I want to make this implement entity. And that's it there. Okay. So now our player object, our player entity object is now of type entity as a child of entity. Okay. So let's go to our application where we're actually adding a player. So we'll go to our command player, command handler. And once we have our player created, we have our domain.player. I want to add a new event to this player. So add domain event. So it's going to be a new player domain. So I'm going to have our request that in squirrely braces first. Request player first name. Oh, yeah, that would help. And then request player lesson. And then we'll have team. Okay, so we're adding a new domain event to our player, and that's it. So we didn't add any additional logic to write that out anywhere else. We're just adding that domain event, and it'll get fired off later. So where does that get fired off? Where does this all kind of come together? In this instance, we're going to put this on our context. So something that saves, that's going to happen right before we do our save. This one doesn't need it because it's just a running out to a logger. But a lot of times domain events are past tense things. So new player added, new player created, drafted, new status updated, all past tense, because we want this thing to happen after our save. So you can do it before, you can do it after, but on new, if you want to take actions on a thing you just created, you'll have to do it after. So pick a direction, stick with it, just make it past tense or pretense, or creating, created, pick one, stick with it. But no, if you do creating in the process, you're not going to be able to take actions on that thing because it hasn't necessarily been stored to the database yet. Okay, all right. So let's add this to our database context. And this will be the last thing we do before we switch back to slides for questions. So we'll go to our database context. We are going to inject Mediatr. So we're going to override our save changes async. We're going to look at our domain entities that are in our change tracker, things that are changing inside of EF right now. We're going to see which one of these are entities, because we now have that super class of entity. Out of those entities, we're getting any, that's this one, sorry. We're getting all of our entities that are being changed. From those entities, we're getting the domain events. We're clearing those domain events so they're no longer in memory. And then we're doing something with them. We're publishing. So mediator.publish each domain event in our event. So right now we only have the one, but if you're saving a large object, you might have domain events on different pieces and parts. So let's go ahead and inject Mediatr to our constructor. Not create the interface, that's not what I want to do. What did I miss here? Why is that not like that?
Be a capital R.
I'm sorry?
Does it have to be a capital R at the end?
Doesn't. It does in the user for sure. Yeah. Gotta love live demos. Oh, package was installed. Look at that. So iPublisher should work. Isn't that the same thing I had? Okay. Must not have been. This is why you saw me copy paste it. Okay, so now we have Mediatr injected. And still not right. Again, copy pasting is always your friend during demos. So, okay, so now we're on board. So now for each of the domain objects, we're looking through getting the domain events, and then publishing. So let's save this. And so in this case, I think I mentioned it, I'm doing the publishes before the save. If you're doing the past tense, you just do the publish after the saves. So that they don't change if you're doing past tense kind of things. Okay, so now if I draft myself again, which is always fun, I'm gonna go ahead and send that. We should see our pipeline behavior as well as our domain event handler. So we see our pipeline behavior with our timer. And then at the top, you say, please welcome Thomas Becker or Tom Becker to the Atlanta Braves. So that's our domain event that got fired. So in that domain event, if you want to do this to be asynchronous, this is where you write something to a queue, kind of just pass it off somewhere else, whatever information you need over there. So that's where you make it asynchronous. That's where you spin off the new tasks. If you have a lot of these things, just know you're taking up cycles every time you have a new domain event. So they're useful, but they can slow your system down depending on how you're using them. If you're just firing things off your queue, maybe not too bad. But if you're taking a lot of doing stuff with the database, then it might take a bit more. So just something to keep in mind there. Okay, so that is the demo. Any questions or anything you want to see before I switch back to slide deck to wrap up? Okay. Look at that copy paste getting there. All right, go away. Okay, wrap up. So domain-driven design is hard, not well suited to most applications, I would say. If it's a small application, juice not worth the squeeze. If it's an application that's already in progress, going to be really hard to do. So greenfield applications and generally larger scale applications are going to lend itself better to domain-driven design. But there are a lot of good ideas we can steal. So keeping it in their own domains, creating entities and objects and values and all those other things we talked about. Great pieces that we can take from domain-driven design. The CQRS pattern just doesn't have to be at the macro level. We don't have to create all these databases to scale up and scale down on the different sides. We don't have to have different microservices. We can do the same thing in code and split those out very nicely. Macro level, micro level has its benefits too. And the Mediatr package is a great tool to help merge all these patterns together and write really clean code. Final questions.
Can you separate the command, the CQRS from the DDD as well, or can you just do the CQRS?
Oh, you can absolutely do CQRS by itself. Yeah.
And where does event sourcing, that's a common term as well used alongside with domain-driven design. Is that, or is that not true?
I don't want to say yes or no either way. I don't know. If anyone else in the room is more well-versed and can say that, I don't know enough to say yes or no. No? Okay. Any other questions?
Did Mediatr have add-in to Visual Studio?
No, it's a NuGet package.
Is what?
It's a NuGet package. And I have a link for that in the end of the slide deck.
So from online, Nanbu asks, should code that adds domain events be in command handler? Does it fail single responsibility principle?
It's a good question. It's using the domain events is more of an event-driven kind of concept. So it just takes things out of process. Is it single responsibility? You're just letting it know that this thing happened. I don't know if it would fail that responsibility necessarily. I guess it depends on how you use it. If you want to do a lot of domain events that are not related to the thing you're doing, then sure, absolutely, it would fail that single responsibility. But you know, it's just setting the same thing. It would be like a broadcast message saying this thing happened, whoever's listening, just like a fan out kind of queue pattern.
So it seems like dependency injection and Mediatr are competitors. You're generally doing one or the other. But
No, you still use dependency injection with Mediatr. You're just taking some of that dependency injection and giving it to Mediatr. So you still dependency inject your in the way I generally use it. You still would inject all of your you can have subclasses and managers or whatever, inject those into your commands or your queries and use those there. So Mediatr isn't taking care of that. So you would still do dependency injection there. If you want to take Mediatr a step further, Mediatr can absolutely handle the requests between different classes. I generally don't do that, but for some applications, it might make sense. So if you need to communicate between two different classes and you don't want to have an injectable between them, Mediatr would absolutely work there as well. So it can take some of that away, but you're not going to get away from dependency injection with Mediatr. Totally.
But it moves the dependencies to the place they need them,
Exactly.
the handlers.
I think I've heard a lot of criticisms about Mediatr, that it makes simple projects complex and complex projects unmaintainably complex.
I don't know if I agree with that comment.
But I think maybe the people that are complaining about that have tried to completely replace dependency injection exclusively with the Mediatr pattern.
That might be true. Yeah, I've used this on some pretty big projects, and it's been a lifesaver really, because especially if you split things out with like the different domains, it makes things really easy to find. It makes your queries and commands as your controllers really simple. Like it makes things really repeatable. That works out well for junior developers. You say this is the pattern, go follow it, and you're going to get clean code from them like a lot sooner than you would if you were saying inject this all the time.
Are your tests easier to write since you don't
Absolutely.
need to build out all these dependency graphs?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Unit testing is a lot easier here too. Yep.
But you do lose F12 go-to that you have without Mediatr.
That's very true. Yep. You do, because it doesn't know where, so instead of F12, you're using find all references, and then you see that's in my handler, that's where you go. So, yeah, absolutely, you missed that. Got a question in the back?
So this Mediatr package reminds me a lot of ACK framework.
I'm not familiar with that.
Same sort of
ACCA?
AKKA.
KK, okay.
AKKA, which is a port from something from Java.
Okay.
Java world. One of the things that ACK does is it ensures that requests are handled in queue-like fashion. Does this do the same thing?
It's not queuing, no. No, as soon as the messages come in to broadcast out, it does not do any sort of, something in front of you, you gotta make. I think it just, something. Yeah, AK, I'm making a note of that because I've never heard of this one.
Is Mediator .NET only, or is it work in the Java world as well?
Mediator is the Mediator pattern would work. The Mediator package is a .NET specific. Any other questions?
But final comment, on DDD, you say it is hard to implement, which is true, but there is a great framework out there called the ABB framework. I did a
ABB.
presentation on it. Probably many people here have seen my presentation on it, but yeah, it
Is that
implements.
in the YouTube? Okay.
It's on my YouTube channel, but yeah, it's a really handy framework that implements all of the best practices for you. It's also part of the .NET Foundation now. It's pretty big. It's a good framework and really does get you started going down DDD easily.
Okay, great. Unaware of that, so something to look at for sure. So, ask questions. I want to put this up. If you have any questions, email me at rbaprogrammer@outlook. I'm on technically on X and Twitter. I haven't posted anything in forever, but I still can be reachable there. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you for having me tonight. I appreciate it. Again, thank you for the flexibility. This was supposed to be a couple months ago. Yeah, thanks for having me up.
How many wins for the Braves this season?
We're gonna break 100 with Chris Sale. I'll be there.
Actually, I got
the World Series.
I got a real quick question from Kevin. You expressed interest in potentially presenting on Cosmos, right?
Yeah, and then I left the Cosmos TV team, so not really interested anymore.
Okay.
Listen to Sydney Edmonds pretty well, then I guess.
Bring back